and welcome to this last mini lecture in our series on the 2020 US election Facebook studies. In this last paper, we look at the paper written by Michael Wagner called Independence by Permission, Industry-Academic Collaboration Explores the 2020 US Election. If you are used to scientific papers, you probably find this a fairly strange article. It's not an empirical article, it's not a theoretical article. It reads more almost like a journal or a logbook entry, and in fact this is really Michael Wagner talking about the process and also giving his opinion on the process. So what basically happens is that that Facebook decided to seek collaboration with US academia to investigate the effects of Facebook on the 2020 elections, the first results of which are published in this special issue in Science. And the article by Michael Wagner is a commentary on the process and the independence and the quality of the resulting research. To understand this and also understand the process of basically the articles that ended up in this Science issue, it is important to look at a bit of history of this collaboration. And Meta or Facebook has a long history of collaborating with academia, but in the past there has been some problems with it. A very infamous study is called the mood contagion study, which is a study in which basically Facebook did an experiment where they just wouldn't show some positive posts to one group of people, they wouldn't show more negative posts to another group of people, in order to see if the people that received more positive posts would themselves become more positive, and the negative posts would become, the people would become more negative. And this study was problematic on a lot of levels. One is a sheer validity argument that the experiment was just carried out in a pretty bad way. But the more problematic aspect was undoubtedly the ethical part, because the people participating in this experiment were in no way informed or consented or debriefed about the study. And when asked to defend this, Facebook pointed out that they had accepted the terms and conditions of when joining Facebook, and these terms and conditions apparently allow unlimited experimentation. But from a scientific ethic perspective, this is not nearly enough to put somebody in experiments, especially an experiment where you deliberately try to manipulate somebody's emotions by manipulating what posts they see or not see from their friends. In reaction to this, they launched a new collaboration, Social Science 1, which was received a lot better. But it turned out that actually a number of the data that scientists received from Meta was flawed. There were errors in the data, which caused errors, of course, in the interpretation. So this was ultimately also not seen as a model for collaboration. At the same time, Meta was under pressure to allow an academic study of the 2020 elections, especially, of course, because in the previous elections there were a lot of rumors of especially foreign influence through social media on the elections. So they had the feeling we have to allow some degree of scrutiny, and presumably they were thinking if we don't allow it voluntarily, then at some point the regulators will be more inclined, or the politics, to force some amount of openness or scrutiny on us, and they'd rather do it themselves. So what they did is they basically asked two senior scholars, both white male political scientists, to lead this project, become the principal investigators, and they could select co-authors from the network under the condition, apparently for pragmatic reasons, that they be Social Science 1 veterans, which automatically restricted the co-authors to mostly American political scientists, all fairly senior. Michael Wagner, the author of this study, did not participate in the research, but he basically did an observational study, if you will, where he observed all the meetings, the whole process. He had insight into how everything went, and he was asked to comment on this process. And Meta did not fund the researchers, as we'll see in a second, but they did have to bear the costs of freeing engineers to help the researchers get the data they needed, which put a pretty hefty bill on Meta to fund this. So this collaboration with Meta, between those senior academics and Meta, was a pretty unique opportunity. It was a very deep collaboration, but at the same time researchers were squarely in the driver's seat. There were four key outcomes that were agreed on beforehand: political participation, polarization, knowledge, and misperceptions. And during the whole process, the academics had the final say over what they want to research and over what they ultimately wanted to publish. Meta could disagree with it, but in the end, if there was a disagreement, then the academics could just go ahead and publish what they thought were the correct results and interpretation. By this deep collaboration between academic scientists and Meta engineers, this also offered unprecedented insight into both the sort of the data structures of Meta, of Facebook, but also the internal workings, the corporate culture, how things went, etc. The academics, in order to retain independence, were not directly compensated, so they did not receive any money from Facebook. But as said before, Facebook did fund the research by freeing engineer time and covering any other costs related to the research. Also in relation to the earlier Facebook studies, there was a strong focus on ethics, so everything was controlled beforehand by university ethical boards, IRBs. And all the studies that looked at individual data had informed consent. And there were very rigorous checks on the data quality to ensure that the sort of mistakes that happened in Social Science 1 wouldn't happen again. And the conclusion of Michael Wagner was that in some ways this process was actually due to the best practices in industry academic collaboration with respect to the clarity of outcomes. And so in that sense, it could be seen as a success. It worked fairly well. The researchers were actually really independent. At the same time, even with this unprecedented collaboration and degree of researcher independence, there were quite a number of strong limitations on it. One of them is that researchers never had access to the raw data. So researchers could never directly look into the database or data warehouses of Meta, presumably for privacy reasons and maybe also for industrial secret reasons. What happened is that the researchers asked the Meta engineers, hey, can you get this data for me? The engineers would get the data from the system and would give it to the researchers. What this meant is that in a way, Meta was able to guide the researchers through the analytical process because the researchers had to ask the Meta engineers, hey, what kind of data is there? What kind of measures are there? How could we answer these questions? And even though Wagner is fairly confident that the engineers were honest in all their answers that they gave to researchers, if the researchers didn't know what to ask, they also wouldn't be able to ask it. Secondly, the network aspects could not be studied. This was again presented as being for privacy reasons. So even if one person consented to be part of the study, they couldn't look at the network of that person because the people in the network were unable to give their consent or did not choose to give their consents. So this means that one of the most important aspects of a social media, namely what happens in your network, could not be explicitly studied here. And finally, even though it is a good thing that there was a very rigorous process of quality checks on code and data, this also meant that the whole process was really time consuming. They started in 2020, obviously, with the elections, and the first studies are published late in 2023. So it took 3 years, even though these are some of the most senior researchers in political science, political communication at the best universities with the most generous funding and amount of research time. Even with those with those conditions in place, it took 3 years to go from the elections to the publication, which means, of course, that the Facebook algorithm that was studied in 2020 is no longer the algorithm that is in use now, and that it is also too late in 2023 to actually make any changes based on the outcomes of most of the studies, because most studies are not actually published yet in 2023 to be in effect before the 2024 election. So even though it is good to be rigorous, the sheer amount of time it costs, but it also means not just times in terms of it takes long to study, but also means that the researchers had to invest an enormous amount of time in this process, which means, again, as they were not being compensated, that this was also only accessible to well-endowed researchers at big-name universities that actually had the time and the researchers to do this. So the conclusion here is that Meta still was able to set the agenda in ways that affected the overall independence of the researchers, They collaborated over workflow choices with the outside academics, but framed these choices in a way which drove which studies you are reading about in this issue in Science. And particularly this refers to the choice to first look at the experiments that were presented by Guess et al. Presumably, Meta could have known that these experiments were very unlikely to give any shocking findings, and that in fact probably the most likely effect will be a null finding because polarization is so hard to change. And it's quite likely that Meta wanted these first studies to be relatively innocent because, of course, the first studies that would be published here would receive the most attention. That's also the studies we're looking at here. They were published in the big issue in Science. And so by setting the agenda in this way, Meta was able to also control the public relations framing in a way. So the conclusion here by Wagner himself is that this collaboration is a success, but it should not be seen as a model for future industry academic collaborations. And he says for this research to be truly independent, the outside academics must not be dependent on the platform for funding, as we saw here was indeed established. But the researchers also need to have access to the raw data that animates the analysis. If you can't see the raw data, you can never know exactly what the engineers are giving. And especially also you need to be able to learn from internal sources about how the platform operates. So you need to be able to understand much better exactly what data is in there, exactly how the algorithms work before you're able to truly study these platforms in the independent ways. And the researchers must not be in charge only of asking the research questions and determining the publication, but they should also be able to more independently guide the prioritization of the workflow to ensure that the platform is unable to steer the results in that way. So the conclusion, and that of course is also what you got from the title of this article, is that independence by permission is not independence at all. There were incredible research and data opportunities, but they were offered to a select few researchers at the expense of true independence. And what Wagner concludes is that what we need to do this more properly is government regulation and data sharing requirements similar to, for example, the EU Digital Services Act, in order to foster scholarship that does not require a social media platform permission. So rather than us collaborating with platforms and being in that sense at the mercy of the platform's decision to collaborate with us at all, to free the sort of resources they need to get the engineers to answer our questions and to go through this process. This data should be government mandated to be available to researchers to scrutinize those platforms and the effect those platforms have on our democracy without this dependence and ads and without permission from the platforms. So what conclusions can we draw from those 3 or 4 papers? Substantively, we've seen in the paper by Gonzalez-Bayón et al. That Facebook does present a fairly segregated audience, that there is quite a high degree of content, especially at the URL level, that is seen only by liberal people, but especially there's a group of, there's a set of content that is only seen by conservatives. And also, if you look at misinformation, almost all the misinformation that was detected by Facebook internal algorithm was consumed almost exclusively by conservatives and by pretty extreme conservatives. And this segregation is driven not so much by the algorithm, but it's driven by user choices of who to follow, and especially by user choices of which pages and groups to follow, because it turns out that the pages and the groups here are much more, cause much more segregation than the actual social contexts, the friends of people. The 2 papers by Guess et al. Showed that if you remove 2 important affordances from Facebook and Instagram, namely resharing and algorithmic ranking, this seems to reduce overall time spent on the platform and overall engagement with the platform quite strongly. So people that get a chronological feed and people that don't get reshares, they spend a lot less time on the platform, they engage less with the platform, and especially if you remove the reshares, you also see less political content. At the same time, removing those affordances increased the moderate content at the expense of both the cross-cutting and like-minded contents, from which you could hope that possibly disabling either of those affordances could also decrease polarization because people are exposed to more moderate items. but experimentally no effects were found on polarization by either of those studies. So where does that leave us? Interestingly, and perhaps a little bit ironically, one of the suggestions that González-Bellón makes at the end of her paper is that it's essential that we replicate these analyses for future elections and in other national contexts. And why I call this somewhat ironic is that in fact we cannot replicate these studies for future elections and other national contexts unless it is the desire of Facebook to engage in such a collaboration again. And even though they might decide to collaborate in a future American election, it is quite unlikely that they will do so in other contexts. And the chance that Facebook is going to be interested in and invested in the Dutch elections, for example, or the German elections, enough to spend these kind of resources is extremely small. So even though this research was a success, this research was probably some of the best industry collaboration we've seen, some of the best research from an ethical perspective, from an independence perspective. The conclusion of Michael Wagner that I think I also fully agree with is that even if it's a success, it should not be the model for this kind of research. And I also agree with his argument at the end that what we need is not a benevolent a platform that kindly agrees to give us data when they want to. What we need is to have actual regulated access to the kind of data that we need to answer these extremely important questions. So we need some sort of mandated access to the data that we need to scrutinize the platforms to understand what the effects of these platforms are on our democracy. This might sound like overreach, but if you realize that, for example, in the banking sector, in order to prevent an economic crisis or to prevent a markets crisis, they have to give a lot of data to the regulators so the regulators can check that they are not posing a systemic risk. And in the same way, the regulation by the European Union also says that we need the kind of data for those platforms in order to prevent a democratic crisis. But then, of course, what is the question? Do we actually trust Facebook or Twitter, X or TikTok to allow this? And do we trust on the EU to enforce this? And do we actually think that this is the way forward and that this sort of collaboration is no longer needed because those platforms either voluntarily decide to give all the data we need, but more likely are being enforced by the regulators to give us this kind of data? Or do we expect that we will see more such collaborations and that we see more of these choices by the various platforms to give specific academics insights into their workings, to give them access to the data at the expense, presumably, of other researchers that might be able to ask different questions? I don't have answers to these questions, but what I really like about these Facebook papers, apart from the substantive insights they give us into the workings of Facebook, the workings of the Facebook algorithm, the structure of the Facebook audience, I really like how they show that you can collaborate with the platforms. That gives a lot of good information. That gives a lot of interesting scientific insights. Ultimately, even with the best scholars involved in the project, with a lot of investment from Meta to make this project a success, we still cannot conclude that this is the model for the scrutiny we need of the platforms that are by now playing such an important role in our democracies.